You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 42. Today we're talking with Sharon Hill of Doubtful News. We'll be talking to her about skepticism, geology, and her research into ghost hunting groups. Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hi, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Jeb Carr.
Hi, everybody.
How are you today?
Doing all right, everybody.
And today we have a special guest, Sharon Hill of Doubtful News.
Hello.
Sharon,
Hi, Sharon
is here to discuss a variety of topics with us, most of them revolving around archaeology, but some of them also revolving around the excellent blog. Is it a blog or a news feed?
Well, it's a blog, but it's sort of like a website, and I do all sorts of news feeds on. Well, I did. I'm sort of I've wrapped it up by now, but it's got 5 years worth of posts. So.
Oh yeah, I think you said there was something like 7,000.
7,000, something like that.
Yeah, which is madness, and I think we'll get to that. But you still work on this. You just don't. So what Doubtful News exists, but what was Doubtful News when it was fully active? And let's just get to this now. Actually, like it wasn't something happened this month, I'm going to write a paragraph about it. It was slightly more involved, wasn't it?
In that voice. Voice.
It was an obsession, more or less. I mean, I did several posts a day at some times. Whenever, I was a news junkie. I would watch all these news feeds for weird news and anomalies and things that were strange. And if I roll back to how it became a thing, I used to follow the Anomalist news feed, which is just sort of a page that's got links on it and a couple comments. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to talk more about those subjects because they would just link to them and there was no discussion about them. And I had more information about them, these subjects, than what was being put out in these links. And often these links were to, really bad, horrible news sites. I wouldn't even consider them news sites. And so I started the blog and I started talking about these things and sort of trying to spur some discussion about it, and then including other links that I knew of that would sort of explain a little bit more than the media story was giving. And I kind of got wrapped up in it, and it became really successful. And like I said, I don't work on it today. I sort of burned out a bit. And so I just let it go, and all the backstories continue to generate thousands of hits every day.
Yeah, I remember when you were first putting this together, and I had seen you on I think it was Twitter. You were talking about this a little, and then the site started to come together. I want to say like 2008 or 9 or 10, something like that, maybe a little later.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I knew about all those sites. I used to follow them. Like I actually had like an items of interest folder in any browser, and there would be about 6 I would open up because I had sort of done something not like what you were doing, but something vaguely similar to my own interest for like friends and stuff. And yeah, there were, you mentioned Anomalous, there was Daily Grail, there were a couple of others. And I think, you said it blew up. And I think one of the reasons why is I could be wrong, but I don't remember there being anybody else coming from really more like looking at these kinds of topics, like unusual alternative science, paranormal topics, sort of strange stuff on sort of daily basis from that perspective, but from a scientific and sort of, more fact-based, more interrogative perspective. I don't remember it being anything, and certainly not at that kind of volume. And I think that's accurate. Yes.
Yes. Nobody had really been as comprehensive as I had planned. I had a pile of subjects. I mean, I went through all sorts of weird news, but also conspiracy theories and cryptozoology and all sorts of things, even UFOs and ghosts and paranormal, all sorts of stuff. And it was from a skeptical perspective. So if a psychic got busted, I would post that news. Well, nobody else would really post that news, or it was across a broader spectrum of sites than one person would normally look at. So
Yeah.
I sort of collected it all together. And when I marketed it to the people I knew who were from the skeptical community. But it didn't take long before the non-skeptical people started to come and look at it. And usually the response was pretty good. I mean, I had some incidents. You know, I butted heads with a few people because they didn't like the take that I was taking. But
Yeah.
so...
Yeah.
you know, nobody else was saying what needed to be said, so I was saying it.
I
Sort
know
of on-
that-
Saying it was right. Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I know that Doubtful News was a go-to source for a lot of people in my internet circle. So I read it frequently, but I saw it referenced a whole lot more than I actually ever read it. And that's just
I've
because
heard that.
it would get bounced around a lot, especially on Twitter.
Right.
It would get bounced around on Twitter a lot. I think it still does every now and then. Like, I'll see a Doubtful News tweet just go crazy across my Twitter sphere. So
And like I said, I still sometimes it'll hit Reddit. An old post will hit Reddit.
Oh, yeah,
and
and
it'll
that-
blow
yeah.
up again. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I could see that. I have one weird question. Jason Colavito actually talks about that he's almost like the secondary publicist for Giorgio Tsoukalos, that so many people, including like production companies, will email him because they're Googling and apparently they're not really into complicated searching. And they will think that that's his site. They will think that that's Tsoukalos. Like, oh, I need to get in touch with the guy with the hair. And they will email Jason. Do you get that ever? Do you get people who are trying to contact like the Zach Bagginses of the world and they get in touch with you?
No, but I get people who can't really read the article and they think that I've written the article that I'm quoting, or
wow.
that I do have a direct connection to whoever I am talking about. So they tend to miss the middle person in there. They don't understand the concept of I'm sort of talking about a news story. I'm not writing the news story. I'm not in the news story. I'm just sort of commenting on it like a media commentator. They don't sometimes get that.
Well, I think Mark Zuckerberg writes all the news I read because that's where I find it. So
it's sort of like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
The best part is when people who are in the story actually contact me and said what the news said was wrong.
I've seen that on your site.
I love that. That's my favorite.
No, that is interesting. Now, we're talking about Doubtful News, and I don't want, we come here not to bury Doubtful News, but to praise it. But you have a very active, you talk about these subjects. What you don't do, and first of all, so what's the website where you do that now? If you want to, I mean, we can always do that at the end also, but where do people find what you're doing now?
Well, I've had a personal blog since 2006 or something. I've been writing there, and it's under my name, SharonAHill.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I write book reviews there, and I read all sorts of paranormal and sciencey books, and just write things that I see in the news now. That's where I write it.
Okay. But
More personal.
But the thing I was gonna say was, so let's actually talk about, and if there's one you want to use, and if it can be an archaeological one, that's great, but if it's not, that's fine. So whichever one makes the best point here, because I think since it was such an unusual thing, and I think a very valuable, clearly valuable, given how much attention it continues to get, service, what would go in? Like, walk us through how a Doubtful News story at like the height would happen. From your side, I'm not saying like the guy who sees that guy in that bizarre lizard man costume last year, but once that's somewhere, it gets to you, and then what happens?
I sort of think about what angle I could present it, and I didn't just copy the story and say, "Hey, look at this! Isn't this funny? Or isn't this stupid? Or isn't this cool?" I tried to think of a more unique angle about it, and it was different for every story. So it was like, okay, well, I know a little bit about this, and I knew the history. Let's take that lizard man story. All of a sudden, there was a guy or a person who looked like they were in a rubber suit walking across the skateboard swamp in Bishopville. What state is it again? Alabama? Arkansas?
It's one of the two Carolinas, and I always confuse which one
okay.
it is.
Yeah, you're right. It's one of the Carolinas.
It's probably North Carolina.
Yeah. And he's doing the haters gonna hate pose, which I think it did not hurt its viral capabilities.
And So it was a story that the local news was covering, and they were getting lots of hits on it because everyone was going, "Hey, cool, look at that. That's funny. Haha," or "That's cool." And some people actually believed it was real. People will believe anything. I'm convinced of that.
Yeah. So
I tried to think of, okay, well, what new angle can I spin on this story that I know about? And I had read the book on Lizard Man. The definitive book on the Lizard Man had just come out probably only like a year or two ago.
Lyle Blackburn, I believe.
Yes. And it was pretty good, and it was interesting, and it's an interesting phenomenon about a small town who has their own monster. And that's a whole other side subject about the sociology of tourism and monsters. But I started to look into what the creature resembled. And I found an old drawing that looked remarkably like this creature, and it had the red eyes that it supposedly had, and it had the right amount of fingers. So somebody had paid quite a bit of attention to this costume and knew a little bit about the monster history, which I thought was cool.
Well, that brings up the whole Roger Patterson with his early pictures, that become. Yeah. And we see this in archaeological hoaxing. I mean, people will pay, and Ken and Sarah have gone back and forth on things like Kensington and whatnot, where you can clearly see, or the New Workoli stones, where after somebody says, this is actually a typeface that your ancient Hebrew is supposedly carved in your stone in, the next one doesn't have that problem.
Another story was the elongated skulls. Was a huge story. Now, I commented on that one. Right. I wasn't tremendously familiar with that whole idea of skull wrapping and deformation. Mm-hmm. So I looked more into it. And then when I was able to post those links for people, I was able to show them something they'd never known before. Well, obviously it's not aliens, but it's really, really strange and something that we're not used to seeing. So I was able to bring in some other links there where people could go and say, hey, this really is a thing. It's strange, but it was real.
Right. And I think in that case, the thing that did not help matters was when INA, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico, they put it out. They made a very good point that particular case, these were elongated skulls, nothing unusual if you're, say, in Oaxaca or in Guatemala, but this was much farther north in Mexico. And they're like, oh, this is unusual. Nobody's ever seen these as far north. And I don't necessarily think that made much of a difference. And certainly they shouldn't have not said that. I mean, yes, that was why the story was cool from an archaeological perspective. But whenever you have even the slight hint of any word of mystery or doubt in any of these stories, it becomes this just like linguistic button that gets pressed. And you can just know that that's going to explode. Like when we were talking earlier on one of my guest shows on archaeological fantasies, and like the Ciudad Blanca, the White City, gets dragged into Nephilim simply because there's the word mystery involved. And at that point, I mean, there's not much you can do except for please tell other people. But yeah, that person's a...
Well, and that however hits on a kind of a sour note for me, because I think we should be allowed to describe things. We as archaeologists should be allowed to describe things as unusual and
I know,
uncommon. But I think at that point, I mean, maybe we should clarify a little bit, but also the media needs to step up and quit being a bunch of dumbasses.
Yeah. No, I don't think Ina did anything wrong. It's just one of those,
I don't think they did anything wrong either. It's when the media gets hold of it and they're saying like, oh, somebody said mystery, woo, and it's like, fucking grow up.
Not only that, but any sensational story and anything that you have to assume that the average person really knows very little about history, about other cultures, about animals. And this comes up with one of my favorite topics is mystery animals, dead things that people find. And all of a sudden it's a chupacabra, or it's a new species, or it's a mutant, or it's an alien. Right. They've never seen these things before because they're just not very interested in
dead
weird
possums.
Things or cultures that they've never really heard about or things like that. So there is a degree of ignorance there, unfortunately, in the public. They're just not aware of these things. So they see them as really, really strange and think that they're a bit stranger than they really are.
Right, but that's when the media should be stepping in and being like, hey, here's this really weird thing. Isn't it weird? And then going, but what it is, and then explain
and ask an expert.
Exactly. And not present the expert as a total moron.
Well, I mean,
and,
you go ahead.
Posting it on Facebook is not asking an expert.
No. And I mean, I can understand when it's somebody who's like, Bob Joe out in the back nine, he finds something strange and he takes a snapshot and throws it up on Facebook. Hey, y'all, what's this? But when your first comment is somebody's like, it's aliens, and then someone else posts and says, no, it's a dead possum, you can't run with it's aliens because that sounds cooler.
Well, Sarah, you and Ken had done the 15-year-old boy discovers Maya City. Which
do not get Ken started on that.
I know. Well, he actually contacted me the day before it blew up. He contacted me. He's like, do you know anything about this? And I had not seen this, and this was my first thing. And I started looking into it. And within about 2 hours of Dave Stewart putting out it's a friggin' cornfield or possibly potfield, as Jeff Braswell put out, I saw this thing. I'm like, that's a milpa. That's a clearly fallow cornfield, like no question.
But Ken's issue isn't that it turns out to be a cornfield. Ken's issue is that the way that it is being handled, it's my issue too, the way that it's being handled in the media and the way that the story is being kept alive is that here is this pure and innocent and uncorrupted 15-year-old who, with his pure and innocent 15-year-old eyes, beheld Google Earth and was able to cleanly pick out an archaeological site that none of these trained professionals could find. And then with his incredibly bizarre, inspired mathematic thing that I still don't understand how that's supposed to work, he's been able to predict 5 other sites. And I'm like, who's verified this?
Well, I think actually brings up, though, some of these themes we're talking about, and one that we'll, I think, get into very much with sort of the meat of Doubtful News. I think one is now the big issue with that story, and it's in everything you just said, absolutely correct. But the problem is this: a 15-year-old saying that, or even somebody working in the media, which may not really be indistinguishable from a 15-year-old saying that, is one thing. The professor that was involved and the space agency that were involved, they basically treated it as this was fine. And I'm sorry, if you work for the friggin' Canadian Space Agency, you might think, oh, gee, why don't I contact somebody who knows what they're talking about and make sure this all goes well?
Okay, to be fair, I didn't even know the Canadians had a space agency. So.
No, they're the one who built the arm that was on the space shuttle.
That's right. I knew.
Yeah, no, they've definitely had an element of that, but I think the fact that it's archaeology. Let me put it this way: if that had been medicine, there's no way that story would have run the same way. I mean, I'm not sure how you could literally map it to medicine, but just assume you see what I'm saying.
I think it would have run that way, though. I really do.
You think if it was like 15-year-old finds a thing?
Yeah, I really do. I really do think the media would have run it the same way, and he still would have been.
No, not the media. Not the media. The space agency and the professor.
I'm surprised he's got professionals backing him.
I think it's archaeology. That's the thing here. And something I'd like to ask Sharon, I'm not sure where we are in terms of time, but something I'd like to ask Sharon is if there are I know everything gets this, but I've actually done a little work, and I've also just been sort of not just qualitatively looking at archaeology. And I think there's certain elements about archaeology that in particular seem to let people go, oh, I don't even have to truth check this, because of course it's fantastical or paranormal or super scientific or something like that. I think it actually gets to a heart of how people sometimes approach our field.
Yes, and for an example, it doesn't happen as much in geology at all. It doesn't happen as much it doesn't happen so much in biology, zoology even. I think that I don't know why that is, but I think it's if the story can be put into sort of a tabloid type headline, it's going to become media fodder, and it's like junk food, and people just consume it and they're not thinking about it, and it's empty calories. It's not really any good information, and it's easy to right now with the way that the news cycle is. They're reporting headlines. They're not reporting news. They're not doing journalism. So they're feeding these things out, and of course you don't have science reporters anymore digging into them. It's very rare to see that.
Yeah.
So you've got this huge I don't know. They're churning out so much garbage because it's easy. So if the story itself can lend itself to a tabloid-like headline, it's going to get picked up.
Yeah, and the research I mentioned, and I think what you're talking about the media, and I'm really glad you mentioned that they don't dig into it as much. And I think part of that's cultural, and then part of that's just clearly funds. There's so much less investigative journalism because nobody wants to pay for it. But David Anderson and I, for a paper we did a few years ago, like a presentation, we actually went through a year of the Coast to Coast AM. I don't know if they still do this, but they did back in 2012. They would put up 5 stories of the day every day on the website. And we compared that with what the shows were about. And I don't want to get into all of it, but basically the takeaway is that they would cover medicine more than certain other things. Because I think it's a lot of, people are really interested in that for obvious reasons. But other than that, it would be other sciences were generally treated in mainstream ways. But I don't want to get into the breakdown, but basically archaeological stories became, in the way they treated them, indistinguishable from Bigfoot, psychic, prophecy, UFO, etc. In other words, they would routinely do stories that were in the archaeological mainstream and throw them in kind of the same way, statistically, that stories about UFOs were, but that stories about geology would not be, or stories about biology other than medicine would not be, or stories about, other kinds of science would not be. And I think after the break, we definitely can. I actually think I do have a idea why that might be the case. And I'd be curious to ask you what you think of it.
All right, well, let's go to a break real quick. And when we come back, we will continue our talk with Sharon Hill.
Archaeotech Podcast, hosted by Chris Webby Webster and Chris Boone Sims, is a show dedicated to the technology of the modern archaeologist. On the Archaeotech Podcast, we interview people using interesting tech, and we dig into the issues, advantages, and try to uncover the disadvantages of the digital age and going paperless. We all know there is no paper in the future, or should we say, paper has no future. Check out the show at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Archaeotech. Let's get back to the show.
And we are back, and we are still talking with Sharon Hill. Jeb, you had a funny story.
Well, we were talking about, so Sharon's background is in geology, and we'll talk about some of the other research that she's done, I think, a little later, but she's a trained geologist. And one of the things that archaeologists often get asked is, did we find gold? That's when we get asked. I also worked in upstate New York, so I also got asked if I ever found Jimmy Hoffa.
I got asked that too. That's a thing in the New England area.
Yeah, but the big one, of course, is to the point where it is quite literally the theme song that intros this show.
It
is about dinosaurs, and I know so many archaeologists that get asked about dinosaurs. Now, Sharon, as a geologist, you get asked what kinds of things, like gold. I hope is one they ask, because that actually makes sense. But what other sorts of things do they ask about?
Yeah, gold, all kinds of fossils. Did you find any dinosaurs? Did you find any footprints? Things like that.
Footprints.
But dinosaur footprints they're quite some think that there are human footprints around in the rocks too, but yeah, like even my parents didn't really know what geologists did, and they just confused it with archaeology and anthropology and paleontology as well. So I mean, there is some overlap, but it's definitely its own field, and it is a really broad field. So like when people ask me about general things in geology, I can't always answer them because I'm not a specialist in seismology, which is a subspecialty. So it's a really, really broad field, but it's funny that people just really don't understand what the field is kind of about. And what do you do is the question I get asked a lot.
Yeah. And actually, there is geoarchaeology. I mean, there are geologists that work heavily with archaeology. One of my professors at Pittsburgh, when I went to college, did that. I took a course in geoarchaeology, and I did really crap in bits of it. But I
enjoy geoarchaeologists to a degree, because when it comes to time to map the walls, that's when I start having disagreements with them, because they see all kinds of things in the soil that aren't necessarily there.
They make so many more strata than we do, because frankly, we're kind of simple folk.
We don't need that many strata.
That's another thing. They say geologists, well, you don't have any soil classes. And I didn't have any soil classes as a geologist.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fairly distinct little part. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's kind of strange. And I really think that interdisciplinary fields are cool, because you really they do mesh in places, but it is hard to explain things like that to people who aren't used to knowing what it's all about.
I think every crew should have a GeoArc on the.
It makes plenty of sense.
No, it makes fantastic to have one.
Yeah. But the funny little thing is, I was just reading an article a couple of days ago. In fact, I think I've got it right here on specifically that, you know what, occasionally we actually should be digging up dinosaurs, or really fossils, because we do find fossils in archaeological excavations. And actually what it seems is that many times fossils, it's by Peter Leeming in a book called The Materiality of Magic, edited by Sari Holbrook and Natalie Armitage. Also found, not illustrated, The Curious Case of the Missing Magical Fossils. Because it actually seems in many cases that when we find fossils in the archaeological record, we're amazed because they're kind of, and this gets into the next thing we sort of teased before the break, we're amazed by them because they're from the deep ancient past and they sort of mean things to us about who we are and what we are. We're not alone in that. If you find a fossil in an archaeological excavation, it is often because it has been recognized as an unusual and interesting stone, possibly given magical properties. There are fossils which are part of some of the slabs at the Maya city of Palenque. You find, of course, there's the whole thing with star stones, the echinoids, the sort of fossilized sea urchins that were given magical. So we actually should. And this article was basically about how archaeologists were throwing out fossils because they're like, no, well, I don't do that. Not in every case, but there's actually quite a few reports where these things should actually have been very much studied and were not. But the thing I wanted to follow up on is I do think archaeology seems to be, and I sort of teased this before, this side, and even with some data, seems to have more of this. And you have looked at literally 7,000 friggin' stories. You have a lot of looking at thousands of things. We'll get to that with your ARIG stuff. But one reason I think that archaeology may actually get more of this is because, and I don't want to get into the whole argument, but basically if you boil it down to its core, one of the things that we do, especially when we talk about what gets called prehistoric, and that's a whole loaded problem term, but before written language or before written writing systems, so before, say, 6,000 years ago, that gets to ideas of origin of everything from everyday life to origin of us. And when we talk about myth and things having a mythic resonance, that charter myths, origin myths, the idea of stories that tell us about who we are and why things are the way they are really important around the world. And I think that actually kind of makes archaeology something that inherently plays in mythic space and time, which then is going to, I think, make it, like we were talking about, more likely to be tied to these sort of sensational things. Is that, from the stuff you've covered, does that make any sense?
Yes, because if people see it as relatable, they could find a piece of themselves in that, and it relates back to them. And I think that's why they gravitate towards those stories. I don't think that they find anything very relatable in geology at all. So it's not going to be a sensational type of story. They just don't see anything of themselves in there. They don't even know what geologists do. Whereas archaeologists, they've seen them actually digging up things maybe nearby them, or they've seen the sites and they've seen the artifacts. So they can see that it looks like something they have or something they would use, or the whole idea of these skulls. One of the big stories was when Lloyd Pye died and he had those Star Child skulls. Well, people were fascinated with those things.
Oh yeah.
People were fascinated with the crystal skulls and stuff like that because it's looks like us, us.
Yeah. Now, the Lloyd Pye one, in case our listeners are not aware, is an actual human skull. And Lloyd Pye, I never met him, but my professors met him because he was Louisiana based and I went to Tulane University for graduate school. So he would come in and bring in the star child, which the people he brought it into would go, yes, that's a human skull, and this is somebody with hydrocephaly. So they have like an abnormally enlarged brain, and they died when they're probably a teenager.
I thought this was a fetal skull, wasn't it?
No, not fetal. Juvenile.
Just juvenile. Okay.
Yeah, like young adult to juvenile. I think actually juvenile, not young adult. Which you can tell very easily because it is a friggin' human, unlike what Lloyd Pye was saying. And he raised tens of thousands of dollars to do DNA testing and all of that. And he got into it because he was interested in hominid, like Bigfootery and such like that. But that was a real human skull. But yes, it then gets dragged in. And I think the relatability thing. So the stereotype a lot of archaeological stuff gets is like, oh, if it's not from Europe, then it gets turned into like this other, like the
mystery of the other.
Yeah, but weirdly enough, when you make it alien, all of a sudden, and I'm just going to say this as bluntly and sarcastically, but unfortunately truly as possible, white people all of a sudden give a crap if you do that. I mean, that's really what Ancient Aliens is all about. It's another version of the old. It's basically another version of Atlantis and imperial colonial hyperdiffusion. But I think you're right. I think that relating, and they can see themselves more than they can in geology or pulsar. And in fact, most of your geology stories on Doubtful News basically seem to have fallen into three categories, if I remember right. One was anything related to possible sounds, hums and
right.
other things. And that was often not necessarily geology, but it could be related. The second one was sinkholes, which you've written about quite a bit. And the third one was stuff that's really geological, but gets turned into spark plugs.
End of the world, yeah.
Yeah, well,
End of the world was big.
Oh, well, End of the World.
The End of the World was amazing. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Are we talking about the Harold Camping?
Any large crack that appears in the ground means end times are coming.
Yeah, you just did a thing on that like a few weeks ago. That's right.
Yes.
I remember that now. Well, to be fair, that one I can relate to. Talking about relatability. I mean, I wouldn't believe it, but that looks terrifyingly apocalyptic if I had run across it.
Now, Sharon, you were
anytime the Earth opens up, people get nervous.
We should be. When the Earth is trying to swallow us whole, we should all be very concerned. Sharon, you were talking about earlier about some interesting geofacts that are being pushed as human remains.
And that's what I was talking about the last relatability one. Basically taking something geological and saying, oh, that's actually blank. And so, yeah.
Yeah. When I work in the mining fields, the coal mining fields of Pennsylvania. And one day a miner came up to our vehicle and he said, "Hey, look at this cool thing I found." And he holds it up and it's obviously an iron concretion. And these things are all over the area. And the strata here in Pennsylvania, where I was at the time, was about 325 million years old. It's Pennsylvanian, Carboniferous, when the coal fields were being laid down. And he's like, "Here, you can have it. It's, I have a ton of these." So I said, "Boy, that's really cool," because I like to collect rocks, which is a bad thing. They're worse than books. They're heavier. So
you can build buildings out of them.
So these iron concretions are in the coal. They're like at the bottom of the coal in what we call the bottom rock, and they stick out of the wall of the mine, and they pop out because they're really resistant to erosion.
Sharon, can you describe what an iron concretion is real quick? Because not everybody who listens to our show is actually part of a scientific field.
I can't really describe what they are. They're sort of like they're
iron and they're concretions.
They're made of iron. They're probably cemented with some sort of iron cement in the rock. Maybe there was like some sort of nodule there, and it was during the diagenesis, the way that when the rock was forming, they became concentrated into this little ball, and for some reason I can't really find a good explanation of how they were created. Some of them are very small. They can form in clay, they can form in ironstone, they can even form in sandstone. And but these are ironstone concretions, so they're very heavy. They're made of hematite or something very, very, or some sort of iron cemented sandstone, and they're erosion resistant. So they're sticking out of the wall of the rock face, and
the iron is getting there by leaching, right? Like sort of mineral leaching, or am I completely wrong on that?
Well, they will leach. They will leach iron stains. There will be iron stains below these concretions.
Okay.
They're oxidizing. The iron is oxidizing now that it's exposed to the surface. So people will pick these things up and say mostly they look like human heads. So this local guy
so
up
these
in
are big.
They can be big. I mean, the one that I have is even bigger than a normal skull. It's about 11 inches across.
Nice.
I had somebody present one like that to me in upstate New York when I was doing archaeology.
It's heavy as anything. I mean, they're really heavy. You don't drop it on your toe.
Wow, that's cool.
And there's actually one at Penn State, which is probably, I'm trying to remember how big it is. It's at least 4 feet across.
Wow.
And it's very spherical. And it's got ridges around it. And it's pretty cool. But I don't know how it was formed. I don't know. It's weird. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, when he gave me this thing and I took it into my office, and one of the guys who was local to the area, he said, "Hey, can I borrow that? I want to take it to Ed Conrad." I'm like, "Who?" So this guy, he collects these concretions. And I says, "No, I'm going to keep it because I figured I'd never get it back." And it looked very interesting. It had like an eyeball shaped thing to it, and it looked very head-like. And if you flipped it over, it looked like there was sort of a brain inside because the iron had little openings and fractures in it. So it was really cool. And it had a brain stem and everything.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now.
Not to give it to him because I would never get it back. And Ed Conrad is well known for collecting these things, sending them to the Smithsonian Institution, and insisting that these were human remains, and that were he says 280 million years ago, but the strata is actually older than that. But he insists that the scientists are hiding it and that he's being repressed. And I believe he's still alive. He's very old.
I believe that I believe that is the case. Have we talked about on the show? I don't think you guys have the documentary. It's something, the Dragon King or something like that Ken's been in, about a guy doing the very same sort of thing in the American South.
No, I'm surprised Ken hasn't mentioned that.
Oh, that should come up.
I should ask him about that when he gets back from vacay.
It was on the filmmaker's website, and it was available. I don't know if it's still out there, so it's not like he was sending me any kind of secret files or something.
It's
but
out
it's out there.
It's out there.
But it was the same sort of thing.
A lot of people find big chunks of rocks. In fact, I remember distinctly a story of sort of a squarish, head-sized rock that this guy said was the skull of Bigfoot.
Nice, because Bigfoot has a square skull.
Well, we don't know.
Well, Jeff, we found his skull.
He looked like Herman Munster, sort of. Yeah, it was obviously it's pareidolia. People see these; they look like human remains. There's zillions of examples of these.
I love geofacts that get turned into wannabe artifacts. There's a email that goes around, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Sharon Hill. The 10 most puzzling ancient artifacts. Well, and that was like one of the first things I addressed when I started my blog was all 10 of these items, but at least 2 of them on there are legit geofacts.
I have had students cite listicles like that for papers.
Yeah, and one of them we were talking about before we started recording was the Klerksdorf spheres, which sound like these iron concretions, because I mean that's what they are, to be blunt.
Right.
But people insist that they're not a natural phenomena, that there's something that aliens or humans or Atlanteans or some advanced race has created, and that they hover and they spin and they're magnetic and they hum tunes and all kinds of weird shit. And it's
I think it's this disconnect people have from nature. They're so amazed at these things, but nature really creates some amazing things.
Yeah.
And the same thing with people. People create amazing things long ago, but they don't believe them, and they have to come up with more ridiculous explanations for them.
Right. And it's just like, you can forgive it when it's nature being confused, like being conflated, like I found this cool rock. The state archaeologist had a whole drawer full of neat rocks. It was just cool rocks that people found that they thought were actual artifacts that they would send to him. Mostly things that look like arrowheads or scrapers or hammerstones and that kind of stuff. And they're not. They're just cool looking rocks. And whatever, they're neat rocks. But it's when you get into something that was prehistoric, something human made, and it's human made by the wrong color people or the wrong ethnicity group. And then suddenly it has to be aliens or it has to be Atlanteans that did this thing. Because the Native Americans couldn't possibly have done something this advanced. And it's like, yeah, actually they could, because they did.
And Sharon, you bringing up the fact that people are not, I think it was Sharon who brought up the not connected to nature thing. I think that's absolutely true. And you see that in those like the dead possum / monster things that you mentioned earlier.
To be fair, dead possums are freaking spooky looking.
Well, yeah. But there I just saw, and I don't have it in front of me, but like a news article. So not like an article, but a news article talking about how biology students, and not just like undergrad, but like researchers, are getting less natural history, and that's actually probably harming their science because they don't know what's out there, and it's limiting hypotheses that can be asked and so forth, because they have they're being trained to more narrowly create a hypothesis, go test it, rather than, by the way, I'll tell you this as an archaeologist, easily the way that I learn the best is being exposed to just huge amounts of things in museum collections and other collections, and going, oh wait, now I know what that is. Oh, I've seen that before, and I think that there's absolutely a truth to what you're saying there. But on the flip side, one of the things that I think especially, I mean, not just archaeology. See, there's a lot of this, but archaeology gets it all the friggin' time. And we beat ourselves up about that. We're not telling people about stuff. Some of this stuff, so much of this stuff is out there. And we like beat ourselves over the head to tell people it's out there. I mean, there are entire groups of, the British Museum has lots of its stuff online. The American Museum of Natural History has lots of its geology, lots of its archaeology online. Some of it's literally in 3D, stuff that we're doing at Miami here as well. People, in many cases, don't seem to care. It's not like, it's not like we're charging like, oh, well, you can only, you'll see people in academia go, this is all because of blank publishing company that's holding it all back, and they use this for arguments for open source. And I'm not, crapping on open source, but the level we're talking about, a lot of this stuff is out there, and I don't think it matters for some people. Like, it's just, that's not going to make a difference. And again, you're the expert on this at the end. Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's always been that way. I think just the way of communicating we have now makes it more clear.
Yeah.
That people are either misinformed or uninformed. Because now we can exchange information, and we can see that or people are giving their dumb opinions online all the time, and they're opening their mouth and displaying their ignorance of the background of the subject. But what's worse is they try to fake that knowledge, and they try to convince the other person that they know what they're talking about. You have the whole Dunning-Kruger effect kick in. The person who knows the least is got the biggest mouth.
Well, to be fair, I rely on that for my own success. But you kind of coined that term, sound sciencey, and that's a big part of stuff that you've been working on. And I think after the break, something we get into is you've done master's level work in looking at, I believe it was 1,000 groups, like ghost hunting groups and whatnot. And I think after the break, maybe we'll figure out what exactly you learned from that. I don't know if I should use the word ordeal, but that journey, that quest.
That is apt. Yes, that's an apt term.
All right. So once we come back, we'll be talking with Sharon Hill about ghost hunting, because I can't get enough of it on this podcast.
Hosted by archaeologist Emily Long, Trial Tales is an archaeology podcast with stories told by archaeologists about the crazy world of archaeology. Emily weaves a tale of wonder and excitement with her intriguing questions and imaginative editing skills. Check out Trial Tales today at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Trial Tales. Now let's get back to the show.
And we are back, and we are talking with Sharon Hill. And Sharon, you have experienced the great phenomena that is the ghost hunt.
Yes, I actually went on a ghost hunt. It was. I don't know how to describe it. It was worse, and it was better than I thought at the same time.
Okay, so
did they give you a PKE meter? Did you get one of them?
The PKE meter.
I don't think I held one. No, I had no intention of holding one, but everyone else had one.
Unless they've actually created a PK meter. There isn't one yet, Jeb.
Well, no, the EM meters.
EM meters, yes.
EM meters, yeah. Well, you can have the K3. I think that's what you're thinking of. K3, K2, K2. I don't know, whatever.
Is that the one that talks?
That's the Ovilus.
The Ovilus is
the Ovilus.
That's the one that talks for you. I like that one. I want one of those.
A friend of mine went to Gettysburg on one of those ghost tours, and somebody not on the ghost tour, they went on like one of those ones you pay to go, but there were a couple of avocational ghost hunters in the group, and she had never seen one of these things before. And so they had it on the talking mode. And if you don't know what we're talking about, folks, it will pick up the vibrations and turn it into English. And so apparently, as they're walking through the hallowed, grounds of Gettysburg at night, this thing is barking out words like butter.
Yeah.
And butter, like just various words that are just, I don't want to.
I still want
nonsense.
one. But Sharon, go ahead.
I could say a thing, but I'm not.
So I went to Fort Hunter along the Delaware River near Philadelphia, and it's a swamp, more or less. But what was nice is that they do rent it out for ghost hunting groups to spend some time there, and it's nice because then you're by yourself. There's no other visitors there, so it was cool to sort of walk around the walls with nobody there, and it's very pretty. It was summer night.
Nice.
And so I said I'm just going to observe. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to be that kind of skeptic. I really wanted to know what they did and how they did it. So they unpacked all their equipment, and they made they made a lot out of it. Oh, this is our equipment. We have some trigger objects, which are like dolls or sounds or music or something like that, or horns.
I just want to break in. I want to break in really quick when you mentioned the doll thing, and that's the Conjuring and all that, and the quote unquote creepy doll. There's actually a discussion in Contract Archaeology. Like April Besaw, I've seen her on her Twitter talk about this, that people need to stop talking about all dolls being creepy dolls. That gets back to our why we see human faces and the pareidolia stuff, but it's really
okay. To be flippant, all dolls are creepy, but why are we not saying this out loud?
Well, it's not that it's that everybody does that. So like every contract archaeologist or people that work in historical archaeology,
there's an entire Facebook group that's just creepy dolls of the field, which I highly recommend going to, by the way.
That's cool.
It really is.
But it kind of gets to it's not ancient alienating the historical past, but it's not entirely unrelated. I mean, I'm not complaining because it's going to happen, but it basically is populating the archaeology with the spirit world. In a sense.
This is a discussion to be had, but I don't know if we should have it right now.
Anyway, back to
Sharon,
the
trigger objects.
So eventually it got dark, and I wondered, this is my first situation being in this situation. I've never been scared of ghosts before. I've never felt a haunting or had a paranormal experience or anything like that. So I wondered if I would be afraid, if I would be creeped out a little bit. I was not. It was completely dark. It was more or less silent, except for the fact that you are right next to the airport, and there are these giant cargo jets coming in every 5 minutes. Which
we call those UFOs. That's what those are.
They were like, you look up and they take up the entire sky. You're that close to the airport, and you have to cover your ears. But anyway, this typical things happen. The meters light up and blinky things like that, and people say that they felt a touch or they heard something, and I was just not impressed. And at certain points, the group split up, and there were two people who said they saw full body apparitions. And whenever somebody says that in the group, then everyone's like, "Oh, wow! Tell us about it. What were they wearing?" And of course, Fort Hunter had been in the Revolutionary War and had active in the Civil War, so they asked what uniform were they wearing, and oh yeah, full body apparition. I saw it, and they were so into it, and there is definitely an element of being the center of attention. Especially for people who feel that they are psychic. So they will say, I feel the person who was unfairly imprisoned in this cell, and I know that you're here, and everyone's watching this person who says she feels this stuff. And I felt nothing, and when I heard sounds, I crawled behind the cell, and I saw the dripping water saying, that's the noise you hear. And after a certain point, they just looked at me like, why are you here? And I'm like, that's it. I got to get out. So I stormed out into the middle of the courtyard area, and it's pitch dark, and there's bugs crawling all over me. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why I'm here. And it was, at that point, it was like worse than I imagined it. But then as I calmed down and I just followed them around for the rest of the night, and I heard some of the things that they were talking about, which some of it was really horrendous. Some of the cases that they had regarding children and what really seemed like mentally disturbed people that they were investigating as haunted.
Is this an asylum? Was this an
No.
asylum?
No,
you're talking about the people making the claims.
the people who were members of these ghost groups that were there. There was like 3 ghost groups altogether. They were talking about their other cases outside of this one, and they were saying that they had an exorcism case, or they had a child who was affected by things in his room, and I was just appalled.
And you're hearing the symptoms, and you're like, this is starting to sound like somebody who needs less parapsychology and more mental health outreach.
It was many years ago, so I can't remember if I said anything. And I can't remember. I just realized that I was very, very angry, and I didn't want to get into a fight. I'm not a confrontational person. I went back to my hotel room and I just paced for a while because I was so angry. And I ended up sort of spilling a bit out on Twitter, which made them really angry with me because I wasn't supposed to be like that. But it just spilled all out. I was very, very angry that they were using what they considered a scientific approach, which was not at all, to go into these people's houses and tell them things that I didn't think were at all true and were potentially making things worse.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that was my beat.
I've seen that sort of thing. I mean, honestly, I can, of these various things, the one I know a bit about more than just the pseudo-archaeology stuff is UFOs and ufology. And I can think of any number of cases where it's just somebody's writing a book and they're clearly writing the book on the back of somebody who really needs to not be encouraged to talk about like all the goblins and demons that are persecuting them. Yeah. But
I mean, on the other hand, many of these people are just doing what I consider, legend tripping.
Yes.
And I think that is sort of the same thing. They're out doing urban exploring or legend tripping and stuff like that. So I think people I'm not in the past podcasts, Ken has talked a lot about context, artifacts and context. And I think these ghost hunters are getting these anomalies and they're totally out of context. They don't put any context on them.
Right.
And they totally lose the meaning of what's going on. And they've created their own separate world and interpretation. Yeah. And I think that can potentially be dangerous.
And because you are a glutton for punishment and going on just one was not enough, you decided to do an entire study looking at 1,000+ groups like this.
So when you did that, I'm sorry, let me interrupt. Before you did that, did you go on trips with each group, or did you only do the one ghost hunt and never went on another one?
I only went on the one ghost hunt. Because quite frankly, they don't want skeptics on their ghost hunts with them. I mean, I had been on the commercial ones before.
Right.
Like the commercial ghost
are nice,
tours.
but they don't really count.
I don't think so. Although they were interesting to see what they put out there as like real history, or what people might take away as real history, which wasn't.
Yeah.
I sort of went back to the local library and I looked things up and realized that they weren't really telling the truth. But
it's all about the story on those.
I've talked about on the show where I did that in the French Quarter. Yeah.
Right. It's pretty easy to look up the facts that they tell you and find out that they're not quite facts. But I was doing a thesis. I was doing a master's in education on science and the public. And my interest was how science may be portrayed in a not quite right way to the public, as a way to give credibility or seriousness, or, to lend gravitas to a subject that really isn't quite scientific. And so I decided to look into all these amateur research and investigation groups that I gave them a little acronym, ARIG. I called them ARIGs. And because I didn't want to call them paranormal groups, because
that was great, because there's no good name for them. There's ghost groups and UFO clubs and this, and the best I can often come up with is, I don't want to call them occultists, although I actually think that's appropriate.
You would be surprised, actually. That would be a very fitting term.
No, I think it would, but in paranormal enthusiasts. And so when Sharon came with ARIG, I'm like, oh, that's actually really useful.
Yeah, amateur research and investigation groups. And that also includes some skeptical groups.
Yeah.
Some groups that actually don't take any paranormal view whatsoever, but they do want to help people maybe solve some weird things that happen to them or some problems that they have.
Well, there's an argument in archaeology that, pseudo-archaeology is part of archaeology. Mm-hmm. And I think you could make the same argument with a lot of skeptical groups where if you're heavily focused on looking at these paranormal things, even if you're not believing in them, at some point you are kind of part of that world.
Yes. It's weird because I don't really fit in either sphere anymore.
Yeah.
The paranormalists don't want me around because I'm too critical. And then the skeptics don't want me to talk about ghosts or Bigfoot or UFOs because I think that's silly and stupid. So I'm in no place in the middle. And I try to keep my hand in both places, but it doesn't always work. So I really don't fit in anywhere anymore, but that's okay because I'm learning from both sides. I can learn a lot from both sides.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that some of the skeptics don't go into these paranormal meetings and conventions and understand that these people really believe these things, and it forms a thread in their life that's very important.
Exactly.
I will tell you as a professor, so many, and I'm not saying the colleagues in my department because they actually kind of get what I'm talking about, but I meet other professors, other people who teach social sciences and humanities, and they do not believe that people, other than maybe a few, really believe. I mean, I know that's been your big tagline. People really believe this stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's been something I've been saying for years. And some of my colleagues, I've gotten in arguments. I'm like, I'll bring up polls. I'll bring up like real, not just like a news poll, how many people are, but like the Baylor research, all these things. And they're like, well, that can't be.
It's consistent.
Right.
I
know it's consistent. Oh, I know.
And April makes, wow. Sharon makes a very good point. I am so sorry about that.
That's all right.
Jesus. Sharon makes a very good point because it attacks people's identity. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. People really do believe these things, and these things are part of a person's identity. And Ken and I go around about this because Ken will get on me because he's like, no, these people are just wrong. And it's like, yeah, they're wrong. They are completely wrong. But the problem isn't that they're wrong. The problem is that by telling them that, you are now attacking them personally. And that's where I got into my split with the skeptical community, because too many people in the skeptical community take that mindset of, no, they're just wrong and therefore they are stupid. And therefore they are worthy of my disdain. And it's like, no, you cannot degrade someone into agreeing with you. That's not going to work. The only thing you're going to do at that point is push people away. If you truly want to change someone's opinion, you have to acknowledge that their belief is part of their identity and then address it as such.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I found is that these people maybe didn't have fulfilling jobs in life. Maybe they wanted to be a scientist. Maybe they wanted to be a professional person and they never got that opportunity in life. But now they were considered an expert in this subject, expert whether they were or not.
Exactly.
But they didn't have to go to get special training for it. All they had to do was on-site training, and they were taught how to find ghosts or how to look for Bigfoot or things like that. And they felt important. Actually, another thing that I thought was interesting is when scientists reject these experiences that people have, where do these people go to? They have nobody to go to. These amateurs fill that role in society where they will take you seriously if you've had this kind of experience, and they will sympathize with you and make you feel that you're not crazy.
Exactly.
And so they play a role.
It's like that commercial in the old Ghostbusters movie. We're ready to believe you. And
that's important to a lot of people because some of these people, like Sharon, you were talking about the psychics. I'm with you that a lot of them are, I don't think they're consciously seeking attention, but it is a cry for attention. Mm-hmm. But I can say that because I don't think I'm psychic, and I don't think they're psychic either. So how I'm interpreting their behavior is, look at this cry for attention. And whether, depending on my mood, is whether or not it's irritating or not that evening. But the reality of it is they do believe they're psychic. And they do believe they're having an experience, and they do believe they're channeling something. And unless they don't, which I have no ability to tell the difference. But I've had several friends in the past who truly believed they were psychic, and it's just something you just kind of have to deal with.
And it's part of their worldview, and you're not going to change that.
Exactly.
It's, those are little pieces of a puzzle that's been put together that make up your life, and you're not going to destroy it. Well, very rarely are you going to be able to destroy it all at once. So I think it is important to talk to these people on their level and say, look, you've had an experience. I'm not going to discount your experience. I'd just like to know more about it, and maybe there's some alternatives. I'm not going to try to bring them over to my side or make them believe what I think is true. I mean, that's just ridiculous. It's not going to happen.
It can actually Go ahead.
What I did learn was that they think that they could use what appears to be science, the science that they may get from pop culture, and they know just enough to be dangerous, and they know just enough to convince other people who don't know very much about science that they know more about science. And I think that that's also sort of dangerous.
It is. It's cult science and like cargo cult science. And
yes, it is.
And it's science-y.
That's what you call it, sound sciencey, right?
It sounds
right.
It's just like you say. It sounds sciencey enough that someone who isn't well versed or even like remotely educated in what science actually is will go, "Oh, this sounds real to me," and this person's wearing a white lab coat. Therefore,
Well, I think that you guys hit on listening to what you guys were saying. Something that I know I've thought about to some degree, but I think it's actually what makes this really hard for us to deal with, and why many of the people we talk to in our various spheres, like, well, I don't want to touch that, or that can't be, or I don't know how to deal with that. And I think one of the things that makes this really not slippery, but almost like, pointy, like it's hard to touch any one place because you're going to get, stabbed with a thorn, is if it was just people, you guys said psychics and mediums. If it was just people who honestly believe that they are psychics, but you don't agree with them, there would be one kind of like sort of compassionate way of dealing with that. If it was people who don't believe it at all and they're just snowing you to make money or attention or whatever, there'd be another fairly easy straight path to take with that, calling them frauds.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on, how good your lawyer is. And then the third way would be people that are in between those. They don't necessarily believe they're part of it, and they're not necessarily automatically, engaging in lies and fraud, but they eat up both of those and they synthesize it into a conspiracy theory that gets tied into issues that we've talked about of representation, and that Sharon brings up of, elements of getting into class and stuff. So the fact that all of those fall under this banner makes this sometimes almost impossible. And so somebody like Ken, who's a little harder edge on this, is absolutely right if it's somebody who's straight up lying to you. And somebody who, like some of the people that have criticized on that approach, who say, well, just bring them in, they're part of us. That's probably very true for another part. Yet you go into these places. I mean, Sharon, you've been to these conferences, you've been to these various paranormal things. They're all there, aren't they?
Yeah, it's uncomfortable, and you don't know what to say, and you don't know if you're walking on eggshells. And then I've gone up to somebody who's got blinky lighty things and sciencey type stuff on their table and say, okay, what does this do? And if I'm able to call them on it, sort of like if they know that I know what I'm talking about, they back off so fast. It's weird how fast they back off. There was this guy, I was at a conference, who was actually in a white lab coat doing an experiment at the front of the ballroom, exploding things, which was actually illegal. You can't do that in a hotel ballroom. You can't bring those chemicals in, but he's doing it. And I forget the point of it, but he was talking something about the electricity of ghosts and things like that. So at the end, I raised my hand and I'm like, okay, you have a degree in, and he's like, oh, I have an associate's in criminal justice. He was totally playing a role, and I was offended.
I had a very similar experience. I went to a Halloween ghost hunter talk with my mother one time, and she gets a kick out of this stuff. It's purely entertainment for her. But there was an actual ghost hunting group there, and they were very small, very local. And they had brought all of their gear, and they had it all set up on a table, and they were, doing a presentation. And good for them and all that. But they start talking about how everything they do is scientific. And this is scientific, and that's scientific. And so at the end of the discussion, they allowed us to have questions. And I said, what exactly is scientific that you do? And he's like, oh, well, we've got this device, and it goes ping. And we've got this device, and it makes a funny noise. And this device does this. And I said, yes, but are you forming a hypothesis? Are you testing that hypothesis? What do these machines do? what are you doing with the data after you've collected it? How is what you are doing scientific? And they just stood there looking at me with their mouths open, like no one had ever considered that.
Exactly.
And I'm just
yes.
like, you're not doing science. You may be collecting data, but you are not doing science.
But this one goes up to 11.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it.
They equate science with being meticulous and systematic.
Right.
That was one of the conclusions that I found in my thesis. So their idea of scientific is not at all what scientists' idea of scientific is. And one of the things that they really missed out, which I sort of focused in on, was the ethos of science. They have no concept on what it means to be, naturalistic only. Not consider paranormal explanations or not consider supernatural entities. What it means to do peer review, what it means to share your data, that anybody could use the same data and hopefully come to the same conclusion.
Right.
None of that stuff they had any concept of. Merton's norms, Robert Merton's norms of science, what scientists should strive to do. And skepticism, just forget the whole idea of skepticism. They misuse that term.
Speaking of sharing data, and we're nearly out of time, are you making some of this research you've done on these 1,000+ ARIGs available? You said a thesis. Is that something you're making available, or you're reworking, or anything like that?
The thesis is available, but in the past couple of years, it was a couple of years old now, I've gotten way more references. In fact, I need to stop looking up references.
Yeah, I know that goes.
When are you done with looking up references? I found so much great new material that I'm expanding it and into a book, and someday I hope that'll be published. Hopefully within the next year. I'm
that'd be
hoping
fantastic.
Well, when you do decide on a publisher and you get that out there, would you be willing to come back on the show and talk about it?
Absolutely. I'll be doing
great.
my podcasting tour then.
Nice.
Oh, yeah.
I don't do a lot of interviews. I get a lot of interview requests to go on these paranormal type shows, and I don't do them anymore because they're annoying. I hate to say it.
I
think some of them want you for a punching bag, frankly.
And I'm afraid of that, so I don't really want to do that anymore. But I do one or two, my friends, people I can trust and know the content's going to be good. So
no, I think that's actually really wise.
I hope we didn't make you feel like we were using you as a punching bag.
No, never, no.
No, I was trying to set you up to punch at archaeology a little bit, but we do that enough.
He
ourselves.
really was. I really want to throw that out there. He was really trying to gear you up for that. So
I try. But cool. So anything else you want to add, or anything else you want to add you're working on before we get out of here?
No, the book just consumes all my time, and I like to read a lot, so I like to do a lot of book reviews. I like to go through
I've been enjoying those.
I'm actually let me see. I'm a little bit more than halfway through Ken's book. The classic.
Which one?
Frauds Mysteries. Yeah. And because I found the first chapter just great. It was so great.
He's an excellent writer.
I loved it a lot.
I loan that out to my students quite a bit. Students that have any real interest in this, especially in my smaller classes, I'm like, when I see an older copy in a used bookstore, I'll pick it up. I mean, I have a new one, but so I can loan them out without too much worry. So I have like 4 or 5 of them lying around to kind of like, hey, if you want to learn more about beyond what I talked about in class, take this. So awesome. I look forward to reading that. Well,
but Doubtful News is on Facebook too, if people want to follow it. I don't update the blog, but I do post a lot of stories on Facebook, so that's still there.
No,
and I can Twitter as well.
I can feel the impulse. Like I can see you wanting to do it, but knowing that way lies madness.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Was it?
I'm like, I can't go down the hole. I can't.
Well, right before we leave, if you don't mind, can I ask? What was it exactly that made you want to close the blog Doubtful News? Was it just the comments, or did it just become too time-consuming?
It was time-consuming. My job was sort of taking more of my time, and at home as well, it was taking time. But I just got tired of writing the same story over and over again.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well,
that's completely logical, yeah.
And you will hear that from other journalists as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In certain fields. I'm not a journalist, but I got tired of writing the same story over and over
Bigfoot can only hide in so many different ways.
Yeah, I gave up on Bigfoot. I tried to give up. Well, I tried. I didn't
Keeps
succeed.
pulling you back in.
It really does.
So, well, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And I hope to see you back again.
Okay, great.
Trials as one will call. No, we don't do a dinosaur.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.